Please be seated. I open this public meeting of the College of Deans of the Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam, for a PhD ceremony of the Faculty of Behavioral and Movement Sciences by affirming that from our Christian origins to the present day, we practice science with a sense of wonder and inspired by fundamental values. Prior to the examination, I invite the candidate to give a brief explanation of the research on which the thesis is based. The floor is yours.
Dear Rector, dear audience, thank you for attending the defense of my PhD thesis titled Personality Determinants of Depression, Suicide Risk and Help Seeking in Old Age. In the next 10 minutes, I will summarize my work's key findings. So, it has been about 10 years that I first thought that personality was important. At the time, I was working at the Belly Psychiatric Hospital as a first-year psychiatry resident in Geneva, Switzerland, in the unit called the Lime Tree Unit of Complex Cases. And these cases were complex because despite the medical team's best efforts, we couldn't reinsert them into society in weeks, months, sometimes years, or even decades. And working with these patients, this is where I realized that what made these cases complex was not as much the severity of their psychiatric symptoms, but more how they coped with these symptoms, which depended on personality. Moving on with my professional work, I wanted to work with older adults. And I got interested in studying suicide and depression in them because these are really concerning issues. Suicide attempts in older adults are 50 times deadlier than in young adults. And older adults consequently die by suicide the most of all age groups. It is estimated at about 25 cases out of 100,000 globally. Depression is narrowly related to suicide, with suicide attempts increasing in likelihood about 60 times in older adults who are depressed. It also affects about 6% of the older adult population. But despite these being very concerning public health issues, prevention is really difficult. So why is that? Well, first, because we lack early indicators. Older adults who present with depression or who attempt suicide usually don't have any prior mental illness. And at the same time, even the indicators and risk factors that we do know about are not very specific because different individuals cope differently with challenges. So if we take 100 cases who have severe chronic illness, which is one of the best known risk factors for both depression and suicide in older adults, only about 25 of these people will eventually develop depression, and only about 3 will attempt suicide. So in order to address these challenges, the main question of the thesis was whether personality could help explain why some older adults are more vulnerable to depression and suicide risk than others. Personality is defined as the enduring configuration of characteristics and behavior that comprises an individual's unique adjustment to life. If we think of an individual as of this willow tree and of the leaves as the very different and multiple ways this tree is experiencing the world around it, then personality could be the underlying patterns. And by understanding and measuring these patterns, we may be able to improve our prediction. So in this thesis, there were 12 studies, and they used a wide range of approaches. Some of them were systematic reviews of the existing scientific evidence. Others were online discussions with family physicians in Singapore. Again, others were data from depressed and suicidal older adults collected in the United States. And then even some of the studies used a video game experiment we designed to measure reactions to defeat and loss of status that we identified as possibly key risk factors in depression and suicide in old age. And taken together, the most important finding of these studies were that older adults who have depression or have attempted suicide have different personality profiles, which are linked to differences in their life trajectories. More specifically, some people had a first episode of depression already very early in their life, and same for a first suicide attempt. And these events carried forward, and they had more events as they grew older. So they tended to have an under-controlled personality, which is defined by difficulties with emotion regulation, impulsive, rash actions, struggling in their relationship with others, and being sensitive to interpersonal conflict. In psychiatric jargon, we can call this also borderline personality. But within this profile, we actually identified two subtypes. One of them had had the tendency to experience sadness and anxiety. And these people also tended to be more careless and lacking self-discipline. A good illustration from a fictional book could be Anna Karenina from Tolstoy's novel. Another subtype we identified had the traits of being self-absorbed and needing outside gratification a lot, and also being inconsiderate or even mean to others. A bit extreme illustration could be found in the picture of Dorian Gray, thinking of the main character. And by contrast, we also found people who had very different personality types. And these people were fine during most of their lives and only developed depression and attempted suicide quite late. They tended to be more sensitive to cognitive decline and loss of status. And in terms of their personality, they either had adaptive traits which were associated with usually positive effects throughout life, such as better ability to seek help. And for example, one of these traits was being outgoing and sociable. But at the same time, some of their other personality traits indicated that they had an over-controlled personality, which is defined as the tendency to bottle up emotions, being rigid and needing control over things, and being perfectionistic and risk-averse. One of these traits was a high need for closure, which is defined as the needing black and white answers in life. And some more traits we found were actually in between, sometimes adaptive and sometimes suggesting over-control depending on context. This was also the case of have the tendency of being meticulous, neat, and detail-oriented. A good illustration would be maybe Uva from the novel A Man Called Uva. So what to do with all of these findings? Well, first, the difference between these profiles that are so stark actually suggest that we cannot just find a set of risk factors that we will apply to everyone. This is why it feels important to include personality assessments in clinical settings. This could help improve risk assessment. It could lead to earlier prevention and also to better tailored interventions to manage risk. Finally, it could help us collect even more data with personality and more systematically so, and this can lead to a better understanding in the future by having future studies and risk prediction models incorporating more personality variables. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would now like to hear whether the candidate is prepared to defend the thesis.
Rector, on your authority and as authorized by the College of Deans and according to the decision of the Dean of the Faculty of Behavioral and Movement Sciences, I am prepared to defend my thesis entitled Personality Determinants of Depression, Suicide Risk and Health Thinking in Old Age, in order to obtain the degree of Doctor in Philosophy.
Thank you. Then I invite the first opponent to start the opposition. And the first opponent is here, Professor Belliot. Thank you for coming here. Professor Belliot is from the Department of Social Psychology, the Faculty of Behavioral and Movement Sciences here at the Vrije Universiteit, Amsterdam. Thank you for your time, and the floor is yours.
On the authority of the rector and by virtue of my right, dear candidate, I want to first congratulate you on a very fine dissertation. I was incredibly impressed by the diverse methods you've used, the large collaborative teams, international teams that you've worked within, how integrative it was and cross-disciplinary. So congratulations, and you were rewarded with your work tremendously. I think at least 10 publications during the course of that work, all very impressive. Today I want to begin my questions with you they will center all around chapter 7, the meta-analysis you did, which I was very happy to see that you've employed these methodologies. I think it was very appropriate use for what you were studying. But there were two specific methodological choices you made, which made me question some of the validity of the results. And then if we have time, I'll broaden out to a more conceptual question. But the first is, I was surprised that you decided to use beta weights to estimate the zero-order correlations that you meta-analyze. And as you know, beta weights can vary across studies because there are different control variables that are used within the models across the studies. And so personally, I've never made the decision to use those. I've wondered in my own meta-analyses that I've done because they are inaccurate estimates of the true effect size, which is in the absence of those control variables. So could you comment on why you used those if you're aware of evidence to suggest this shouldn't be a concern in terms of generating an accurate estimate of the true effect size? And could you comment on that, please?
Learned opponent, thank you for your question. So this was the very first meta-analysis that I have done in my life. And in terms of the challenge we faced from the start is that the studies were very different and reporting statistics in very, very different ways. Even when we tried to reach out to authors, we didn't always get the statistics we needed. And then using this method was a way of still putting together the estimates in a way that was standardized. I do know about the limitations, and I think we also stated them in the limitations section. It felt that if we didn't do this, it would have been hard to synthesize the findings, and we already restrained from synthesizing findings that were too different in many parts of the systematic review. But for at least studies that use the same scale, we still felt that the meta-analysis was adding some level of evidence. It may not be completely accurate, and then the estimates may not be completely completely reliable. But we did feel that it was better to still have at least some meta-analytic estimates than not having any at all.
Okay, thank you. And a second question about the methodologies was you used a method to evaluate the quality of the evidence or the risk of bias, as you put it. And I wasn't so familiar with that technique, but in general, I've been unimpressed with attempts to try to estimate the quality of a study. And maybe you could comment on that methodology specifically and any evidence you have for the validity of it. And maybe, what were the top 3 or 4 characteristics of studies that really would have caused some, them to fall? 50% of your studies were not estimated to be of high quality. So what were those factors that were labeling them as low or medium quality?
So yes, in other medical fields, I think these scales to estimate quality of evidence are maybe a bit more frequently employed than in psychiatry and also psychology. It still feels that at least evaluating whether the quality of studies may have impacted the evidence synthesis we are doing, it feels something that will add to the validity of our work. So this is why we did it. And we did it in a very systematic way with different people evaluating the studies separately and then coming together in consensus meetings and making sure that our scores were aligned. But in terms of why not all studies were high quality, well, very simply, a lot of the times they lost points because they didn't report all the information we needed. It doesn't mean that these studies didn't do the things correctly, but sometimes in the articles that were the results of the studies, they didn't report those information because also some studies were published much earlier when the reporting standards were also different. So I think only very few studies posed really serious concerns. It was really a minority, maybe just one or two. And then all others had moderate or high level of quality, which felt reassuring to us. Yeah.
Good. Maybe just to follow up on that, because maybe if you were to apply that methodology to your own work. And so I think of specifically in chapter 8, for example, if somebody wanted to go to your work and do a meta-analysis of late onset suicide attempters and their differences in personality characteristics, would they use that same methodology and evaluate your own work as being high quality and low in risk of bias?
Yes, well, the chapter 8 is definitely something that would probably lose some points because, yes, I completely agree that some information that now I systematically report in my studies, I did not report back then. This was also my very first data paper. And I think both the standards of the field have evolved since this was published, but also my own standards of reporting had evolved, and partly because I did the meta-analysis and employed these tools to evaluate their quality.
Yes. Do I have time?
Yes, sure.
Oh, thank you. Your work centers around, or that chapter 7 centers around the concept of help-seeking behavior, which I found fascinating and interesting to read about. I study pro-social behavior, and it made me think, well, what are the distinctions between these forms of behavior? And we know a lot about the personality determinants of pro-social behavior. In that context, well, I will say, would we expect the same results then to apply the same kind of personality variables? So I think of agreeableness, honesty, humility, social value orientation, trust disposition, Machiavellianism, competitiveness, those same associations with pro-social behavior. Should we expect them with help-seeking behavior?
I think that definitely if people are more pro-socially oriented, they're like just out of face value, it feels like they would also be better at seeking help because there is a certain form of trust in others and wanting to connect with others. Then at the same time, we found some personality traits, I think, that increased help seeking, and we were also surprised about because usually they are maladaptive personality traits, such as neuroticism or borderline traits that increase the help seeking behavior, not the willingness to seek help when people were asked in theory, but what happened in practice was that these people sought more help. And probably these people are not necessarily more pro-social, but they find themselves in situations where help seeking becomes inevitable. So there is still distinction, but probably most adaptive traits will lead to maybe more pro-social behavior and also better help seeking. Yes.
Or?
Yeah, thank you for your questions. We move on to the next opponent. Thank you. And for the next opponent, we go online to Professor Waren from the Department of Psychiatry and Neurochemistry from the University of Gothenburg in Sweden. Professor Waren, I hope that we can see you as well, looking at the technicians. Thank you for joining us today in this ceremony, and I thank you again for your time and efforts to do so, and the floor is yours to ask your questions.
Thank you. On the authority of the rector and by virtue of my right, I would like to compliment you, dear candidate, on the extensive and high quality work in your thesis. And I'm especially just thrilled that you chose to look at the subject of personality. Because it is so little researched in the older adult suicidal behavior. I'd like to concentrate on age and age of onset. And I'd like to ask you, what was the rationale for using this cutoff at 50 for many of the papers in your study?
Learned opponent, thank you for your question. So in the very first study, we published about this distinction between early onset suicidal behavior and late onset. We used the cutoff of 50 because this was the median split in the sample we had of older adults who had attempted suicide. And then later on in subsequent papers, it felt right to reuse the same cutoff to also assess whether the other findings could adapt to the things we had already found. But I think that in terms of, just clinical meaning, 50 can be seen either as like a certain turning point in life, because for some people, it feels like the first half of their life and then the second half of their life, even though, no one knows how long they live. But at the same time, it's also maybe a bit of an early cutoff if we really speak about old age, because old age doesn't start at 50 years, it starts later. Well, we also had the sample that was, even though composed of older adults, using a much older cutoff would have made the late onset group very, very small and probably insufficient for analysis. And then again, a clinical consideration. We also want to...
I'm sorry to interrupt you,
Sorry.
dear candidate. I didn't quite get what you said. If you had an older group with a higher range, you'd have fewer with late onset? Did I understand you correctly?
No. Oh, sorry. So I said that within the same sample that we had from the longitudinal program of in late life suicide in Pittsburgh, the attempters' age of onset was such that if we had used a much older cutoff, then the late onset group would have been...
Right. I'm sorry, I'll cut you off there because we don't have much time, and now I understand what you were saying. But in a perfect world, if you could set up a study, in your future career, what would you be thinking about there in terms of an appropriate age cutoff for late onset, early onset?
Yes, so in an optimal setting, if I had the sample I would have dreamed of having, then I would probably have set up something as 65 years of age, which is a more standard cutoff between late life and middle age. And then there are also other methods we used later in this body of work that use, for example, Gaussian mixture modeling that really looked at what is the distribution of age of onset within the sample and whether there are different distributions together that we could separate by using a more data-driven cutoff than this median split at 50.
Thank you. Then I'll go ahead with your idea about a future study, having learned from what you've done and the existing literature. Would you be able to do the kind of tests that you use? Would you be able to apply them in this older population that you'd like to look at? Do you see difficulties there?
Well, there are several barriers or limitations. I think in general, probably we could find ways to use most of these assessments in older adults, but maybe some of them would need some additional adaptations. Well, first, already personality questionnaires are not always adapted to older adults because there are questions about, for example, how well one finishes one's work or how well one is doing in a professional setting. But if one is retired, then it doesn't apply all that well. Older adults have sometimes a different lifestyle, and personality questions tend to also affect lifestyle. So there should be questionnaires more adapted to older adults. That's the first thing. And then secondly, for example, the behavioral task we used while the older adults had also a clinical assistant there to make sure that they understood the task, and then the technical parts didn't pose any problems. And I anticipate that this would be the case also for a lot of similar behavioral assessments if we were to do them in even older populations.
So could you say something about the generalizability of your thesis results for the older population? I say the older population as if there were one, but of course it's different is different in different cultures, but we know that the populations worldwide are aging. Would you like to comment on that, the generalizability?
Yes, and generalizability is a problem. And then these studies were carried out in very specific populations. And those populations reflected the demographics locally. So the population of the longitudinal research program in late life suicide in Pittsburgh reflects the demographics of Pittsburgh, but this is majoritarily white older adults. And even so, we could argue whether an American population reflects a European population, even among people from the same race. So definitely there needs to be more done to understand the findings cross-culturally and across several world regions. And most of the research so far in suicide has been done in Western countries. And right now there are more and more studies in Asia, but we are still lacking evidence from Africa a lot of the times. Personality in itself may not be exactly similar across cultures. And then, yes, I think in the future we should also look into whether personality traits even behave the same way. And some people already started saying that Asian populations may have another dimension to add to the 5 factors. So there is a lot to do, but it feels important to have an initial model, even if we don't know the generalizability yet, and later we can refine it with more studies.
Okay, thank you. Now we have 2 minutes left. So I'd like to bring up the question of cognitive impairment, and that we're seeing now more and more studies coming out that are talking about mild cognitive impairment as a risk factor for suicidal behavior in older adults. So can you tell me something about what happens with personality when a person has mild cognitive impairment? And how might that affect results? Yep. We only have a minute, so
yes.
Sorry about that.
Well, you can still find usually the same traits in people. If the traits are maladaptive, they tend to remain so. Sometimes some traits decrease. For example, conscientiousness actually decreases as cognitive impairment gets worse in older adults. But what we have seen is that what seems to be maybe a higher risk factor is really the preclinical stages of early cognitive impairment, and not as much when the cognitive impairment is already impacting personality.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Waan, for your questions and also for keeping so strict on the time. That leaves us to move on to the third opponent present here today, Associate Professor Kok. Welcome. Professor Kok is from the Department of Sociology of the Faculty of Social Sciences and Humanities of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Again, also to you, thank you for your time and your efforts, and looking forward to hear your questions.
On the authority of the rector and by virtue of my rights, dear candidate, I'd like to first compliment you with completing this indeed impressive thesis with a lot of different perspectives, data and angles on the topic of suicidality in old age. Also want to include the promoters in that. And of course, I'd like to continue the discussion about your work. And I'd like to start with a question on chapter 4, and with a very specific sentence in the discussion of this chapter. On page 68, you write that in a previous publication, you, or at least your promoters, when I look at the reference, concluded that improving any aspect of social health could work to reduce suicidal ideation and suicide risk. And I was wondering how to reconcile that with the findings of chapter 4, because first you do not find an effect of social health on suicidal behavior ideation in 3 months. And this is actually the period where the strongest changes take place. And maybe also the most clinically relevant period. So if you evaluate the findings from chapter 4 and compare that with this statement about improving any aspect of social health, which also suggests an intervention, which is not in your chapter, then how would you qualify this statement?
Learned opponent, thank you for your question. I think maybe the answer lies in figure 4.2 on page 63, which summarizes what we actually found in this study. And so even though we did not find any short-term effects of social support and social connectedness at 3 months from baseline on ideation, we did find effects on ideation presence and also ideation severity for social connectedness and for social support on ideation severity longer term. And this study had an average follow-up time of almost 2 years. So it still feels like that in a big picture, improving social health will have long-term beneficial effects. I agree that it may not be a short-term solution if someone is in a suicidal crisis. It may not be the best time to try the person to get more sociable and to join new social circles. Because first you need to treat the acute symptoms that makes the person feel so miserable that they got into this downward spiral of being in a suicidal crisis.
So if there is a acute problem, we shouldn't refer to social support or...
Well, that's still not what I said. I think it
Okay.
is something that we should start as soon as we can. And I think we should even start it before someone is in a suicidal crisis or even depressed. Social health should be evaluated together with other aspects of health already in older adults who seem completely fine.
Yes.
And then maybe all of this could be prevented. But in any case, if someone is in a suicidal crisis, we could already start improving or trying to make sure that they will be able to improve their social health when the time is right, in parallel of maybe other methods that will be better suited to handle the crisis at hand.
Right, thank you. And then further on this, it was about any aspect of social health. Now, I also looked in your thesis whether you address loneliness, which also seems an important factor when aging. So could you reflect on the relevance of loneliness, perhaps as an indicator of social health, which was not empirically in your thesis? Should we also measure that, or maybe you cover it already with what you measured?
No, I think social health is definitely composed of so many things. And here we studied social connectedness, social support, and loneliness is still another aspect. It's on the negative pole of course, if someone is very lonely, they don't have obviously good social health. And so I guess one thing we still lack understanding of, and how are these social variables really related to each other? Does being maybe a bit low on social connectedness or social support highly correlated with loneliness, or are these different things? Can one feel lonely even if they are well supported and well connected? And
Is that possible?
I guess it should be possible.
Do you think it really adds information to your different variables on structural and functional social networks?
Yes, I think that definitely in future studies, we should also include loneliness and then see among these social variables, what is their predictive value for depression and suicide risk in general.
Okay, then pushing still a bit further, because I think, yeah, loneliness might add something to the measures that you use, but at the same time, we see that it's highly correlated with depression. It's always a bit tricky, like what are we looking at if we have loneliness and depression? So do you still think if you have your social variables and you have depression already in your model, that it still might be worthwhile to measure loneliness?
Well, I still feel so. And then, as you saw, most of the studies in this thesis were cross-sectional. The one actually in chapter 4 was one of the only one that was a longitudinal study. And what we also maybe lack understanding of as what is the chronology of events. Is someone first becoming lonely or losing social support and then becoming depressed, or are they already depressed and then becoming lonely because they isolate themselves? And learning about these processes and maybe how they relate to personality, because probably there are different scenarios and those can maybe also to some level be explained by personality. So all of these will give us additional answers, but this needs to be studied longitudinally so that we can see also the chronology of events.
All right, thank you for the answer. Then I have another question, which is a bit different. It's more a broad question about your general discussion. And there you have these two profiles, which seem to be sort of on extremes of a continuum from under control to over control. And then in between you have this block with resilience and healthy aging. And healthy aging, this term, it occurs a couple of times in your thesis, but I was not really clear what you mean by it and how that relates to resilience, in the context of your thesis, of course. So what is healthy aging and how does it relate to resilience?
So, well, healthy aging is probably a way of finding balance between different forces. So here, since this thesis was on personality, definitely what felt a healthy way of aging in terms of personality was to have a reasonable amount of control, but not being in an over-controlled personality, neither a completely under-controlled, because we saw through the chapters that probably those extremes will be at risk for depression and suicide later on. But then basically finding this balance and adapting to different challenges in life, because it is a dynamic balance, right? Like life keeps happening and throwing challenges at older adults. It's a difficult period of life. So being able to find this balance, this is resilience. This is just how we still manage the balance, even though things are happening. And in terms of mental health and maybe also personality, this is healthy aging. There have been qualitative studies where older adults who have attempted suicide or who have been depressed are talking about what made them come out of these situations. And usually they mention balance in some ways, that they are still all the time, they need to monitor themselves so that they keep in a healthy line of things and not falling into another depression or another crisis. And being able to do that, that's what I was calling a resilient personality.
Right. So it seems that you support the recent definition of health as maintaining resilience.
Yes, definitely. I think that is what we need to promote in health in general. I think all aspects of health, social, physical, mental health, there are factors of resilience that we could promote also as clinicians, and that could help people age better and maybe not even become mentally ill or ill in other ways.
All right, I'm looking at the rector.
Yeah.
How I'm doing in time.
I would like to move on, if that's
Sure.
yeah. Thank you for your questions, Dr. Kok. Yeah, we switch on to the screen, to the big screen again for the next opponent, Associate Professor Hadlatsky from the Department of Learning, Informatics, Management and Ethics, and from the National Center of Suicide Research and Prevention of Mental Health of the Karolinska Institute in Sweden. Professor
Thank you very much.
Latsky. Yes.
Thank you very much.
We see you on the screen. If you could unmute yourself, please, then the floor is yours to ask your questions.
Yes, thank you very much. On the authority of the rector and by my right, I would like to congratulate the dear candidate for an amazing body of work, which I think in most European countries would qualify to be not one, but 3 PhD dissertations. And I would like to go on to ask some questions which are specifically related to, or in particular focused on suicide and suicidal behaviors. I feel that you've done an excellent job in elucidating the complexity of long-term vulnerability pathways and risk factors. I think that it's brilliant that you look at different sides basically of these risk factors, that certain personality traits can be adaptive in certain contexts and maladaptive in other contexts, and that age would be one of these variables which could change certain constellations to be from adaptive to maladaptive. And I think that this makes a lot of sense from the perspective of depression. It also makes sense from the perspective of suicide. But I think the distinction between suicidal behaviors and suicide itself is that they are usually a specific event, a particular event that occurs in a certain person's life. And I think that one question that is interesting when it comes to suicidal behaviors is when the suicidal behavior occurs. So most individuals with chronic risk factors and constellations never attempt suicide, and some, even those who do attempt suicide, probably had those chronic risk factors the week before, and that week before they did not attempt suicide. So one model that describes this difference and this dynamicness of suicidality is the fluid vulnerability theory, which brings thoughts to, it categorizes risk factors into distal and proximal risk factors. And I was wondering if to me, it feels like a lot of your thesis speaks clearly about distal risk factors, but I'm curious if you think that anything in your thesis may explain how proximal processes or triggers may interact with those factors that you found relevant.
Learned opponent, thank you for your question. And this is a very important distinction between distal, more vulnerability factors, and then proximal risk factors. We did find maybe a few clues about what some proximal risk factors could be for those who only become suicidal late in life. For the ones who become suicidal early in life, also reading just their life stories, it feels like that every now and then they come into situations where there is an extreme level of stress with interpersonal conflicts, maybe other forms of stress, financial, health related, and then those triggers events, even though this is very approximate. But in terms of the ones who only become suicidal late, we found maybe 2 things. The first one was that, as we allude to it in chapter 10, even though the sample size for the prospective analysis was very small, we found that they had a little bit more cognitive decline at 2 years than the people who had an early onset of suicidal behavior. And this shows also, this aligns with other previous studies by other authors and shows that maybe this acute stress just around having these initial cognitive symptoms, that could be something for someone who is very neat and very meticulous and controlling, that could maybe just precipitate something that they feel like the only way to remain in control would be to attempt suicide. Of course, this is just speculation at this point, but something to test in the future. The other thing is, in the last chapters, we developed this task to test loss of status. And it seems that the people who have an early onset of suicidal behavior and the people who have a late onset, they are sensitive to different parts of this like loss of social status or social defeat. So the people who only attempt suicide late in life, they are sensitive to just losing social status, and that's what they try to prevent in the task. And they don't as much try to prevent losing in one-on-one duels, whereas the people who have struggled with suicide for a longer time, they seem to be more sensitive to the interpersonal one-on-one aspects of this defeat. And so this loss of status is also something that described qualitatively by other authors, that the older adults who have made serious suicide attempts felt defeated in some ways, or they felt that they could not improve their social status anymore. It was only going downhill from that point on. So these were maybe the two elements. And of course, again, not every element applies to everyone. And that's also what makes it so complicated.
Right. That was the perfect segue to my next question, which was about the social defeat video game. Do you feel that, what is the strongest empirical justification that this game, that the behaviors that it elicits are similar to the real life process of status loss and social threat?
Well, of course, as any simulation of real life, it remains a simulation, and this is a big limitation. But the fact that, for example, people who endorse having a certain number of traits that would make them more like narcissistic, or they have a higher narcissism score, they do react more extremely to the outcomes in the game. That shows that maybe so the game structure triggers the same type of motivation and the same types of behavioral reactions than some real life scenarios. So of course it doesn't mean that it's exactly equivalent to losing in a video game than to having a very big stressor in one's life. But there are definitely maybe patterns, and then those patterns, we could capture them in the game, and they aligned with what we measured with questionnaires about how people behaved in their real life.
Thank you very much. I agree with your analysis of this. I have a final question, which I think I have 2.5 minutes left. The final question is, if you would carry out the study in the future to distinguish or to understand how these different findings that you have in your PhD may relate to proximal risk factors, how would that study be designed?
Well, in an optimal world, I would like to have a much bigger sample that would be a population sample or something close to a population study of some size, where we don't only have people who have been mostly recruited from hospital settings who have attempted suicide, but also a lot of older adults who have attempted but never had any psychiatric history earlier. And then in this sample, we should also have a lot of variables and information about their social life and their everyday behavior. And then I think we could actually look at how what we found in the samples that were studied in this thesis, how they would also relate to actually a real population. So
I have still 1 minute left, so just a quick yes and no question. Do you think that ecological momentary assessment would be feasible in this age group?
Yes, so ecology momentary assessments is something that actually the group in Pittsburgh has already started doing in the older adults who have attempted suicide and also who are depressed. And it is definitely a good tool because it can assess day-to-day behavior and day-to-day emotions. So the COBRA task that is in the last chapters has been actually tested together with ecological momentary assessments in undergraduates, psychology undergraduates, and they behaved in many ways very similarly in the task and to what they reported in the ecological momentary assessments. That study was not included in the thesis, but was also done as one of the several validations of the task.
Perfect. Thank you very much. This took exactly 10 minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hadlatsky. Thank you for your questions. Now we move on to the last and final opponent of this opposition, Dr. De Beurs. Welcome. Yeah, I'll announce you from the Department of Clinical Psychology, the Faculty of Social and Behavioral Sciences of the other university in Amsterdam, here, the University of Amsterdam. Thank you for your time and your effort, and yeah, thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much. On the authority of the rector and by the virtue of my rights, my dear candidate, I would also start by congratulating you on this amazing piece of work. It shows also a major power of creativity and originality, also reflected in your bio sketch, where you also moved and lived everywhere and are also planning to write a fantasy novel. That's something we'll discuss a bit later on. I would like to pursue the discussion on a topic which seems very logical to include, but it was not included. And it wasn't reflected in your presentation because you addressed Anna Karenina and Dorian Gray. And then I thought, this is getting where the thing I'm missing, but then you didn't really pinpoint it. So I would like to discuss it with you, the role about gender. So I assume you are familiar with the gender paradox in suicidal behavior?
Yes, learned opponent, thank you for your question. Yes, I am familiar with the gender paradox. And I did not...
So maybe first for the audience who came all the way, what is the gender paradox in suicidal behavior?
So if I remember correctly, is that women make more attempts, but men die of suicide.
Yes, and specifically because you're absolutely right about that, they say that younger women do more attempts and older men more die often by suicide. But I didn't find in your papers that this theory was not mentioned anywhere. At least it was quite thick, so I might have missed it. But my Control F didn't find it, and it seems so highly relevant to all your findings. So I was just wondering, what was the reason for not elaborating more on that?
Well, you're absolutely right. We did not include actually reflections on the gender paradox. It is an angle that we didn't really consider, and maybe we should have, because I think even with personality assessments, it is quite important. We know that the way that borderline personality disorder is diagnosed, it's biased towards women just because the symptoms are more visible in women. It doesn't mean that men cannot be borderline or have borderline personality disorder. And maybe one interesting piece, even though we didn't elaborate on the gender paradox there, was in chapter 10, when we found that there were somewhat more women among the two early onset profiles, the one that was higher on higher on neuroticism and lower on conscientiousness had more women, whereas the one that was lower on agreeableness and higher on narcissism had more men. And maybe there is something also there. But then in terms of the sample we had suicide attempters with high lethality attempts. So these people escaped death because there was an element of luck. They, without medical attendance or someone finding them, they would have probably died. And in that sample, we did also still have a lot of older women.
Yes, no, that's a good point. But still, I think because you also want to make a general theory, especially in the end, I think you start with this great theory with all the risk factors, and then the gender aspect seems quite still relevant to include, especially because there was another term that I missed, which is highly prevalent in the suicide literature, acquired capability. So that actually the idea is that males mostly die more often by suicide because they just are more lethal. They use more lethal methods, and that's why they would die. So that would be quite a relevant mechanism. So how would you, if you look at your theory now, how could you incorporate gender in that, in your final theory?
Yes, so I think we didn't even have a lot of conclusions about gender because of the sample was quite well balanced between males and females, we didn't have a lot of other striking differences, except for the one I mentioned to you. But I think that well, there is definitely something more that we should study about the mechanisms and then how the whole process goes from having certain stress factors, having certain personality traits, and then from there going to making an attempt, and with which method, and how long after these stressors are there, and also, what is the social circle of women and men in old age. We know that women sometimes tend to have a better social circle, even if they are bereaved. So there are many other aspects that we didn't really study in terms of gender differences that I think in the future we also should to add more nuance to what we reported.
Yes, so there was no specific reason, more that you had so many other things to focus on that just gender slipped through. I think that's also what I found really difficult in the whole individual differences approach, where you really want to, because then actually it seems like every person is so different. So I just worked at we made guidelines for suicidal behavior, and then it was so difficult to really advise clinicians for this one person sitting in front of somebody. So do you have any idea how, also as what my other colleagues said, how would you study these individual differences? How could you really come to an individual profile, which is something I also don't have an answer for. So any suggestion would be welcome.
Yes, so I think that, well, we cannot, of course, nail the profiles straight away because we are not studying them in clinical settings already. And that's a problem. We study them in longitudinal programs, but we need to bring these personality assessments and other long-term ways of profiling people into the clinic. That's the first step. Then, once you have profiled people, you could offer different methods. I know that most of the suicide prevention interventions right now use dialectical behavior therapy, DBT, or some version of DBT, because in younger suicidal individuals who tend to have these borderline traits, these methods are highly effective. But now we have seen that there is a number who have more on this over-controlled personality, and maybe newer psychotherapeutical approaches that tend to be effective for perfectionism, for example, such as I think it's called acceptance commitment therapy, ACT.
Yeah.
Maybe in some people, this would be the better approach. But without profiling individuals, it would be hard, to know which therapy to offer to whom. And as I said that in my presentation, personality may add us another layer of abstraction that can be helpful in this forest of different things that a person is experiencing and are contributing to their crisis.
Thank you very much. That's quite clear. I will fill the time until the pedal comes in. So I will then go to another question on, so if you are then considering gender, another thing to consider, and I missed it also in the, so the contemporary theories on suicidal behavior are really ideation to action models. So they really make a difference between people with suicidal thoughts. And then luckily, most people don't go on to actually do a suicide attempt. But I didn't find it in your thesis. So, but I think that's really important also to better understand risk factors. So there's a different way in treating people who have just suicidal thoughts, and then only 1 in 4 goes on. So does your research give us any more information to understand this ideation to action gap, and maybe reflect on the role of these theories in your work?
Yeah, the opponent is perfectly right that suicidal ideation doesn't mean that there will be an attempt. And I think that's why also we tried to focus most of these studies on actual behavior, because what we really want to prevent in individuals like the most is that we would want them to prevent attempting suicide if they ideate about it, but then eventually we can find a way to get them better. That's the risk is a bit lower because it's not and this like obvious urgent risk to their life. So this is why we try to focus as much as we could on behavior. But we did compare the people who had behavior with a group in several studies that only had ideation and never attempted suicide in their life. And on many variables, we saw that this group looked very similar to the group that started attempting very early in life, and actually looked quite different from a group that was depressed but never had any suicidal ideation. In terms of premeditation, and then when does the ideation become an attempt, and whether that also requires some acquired capability, as you mentioned. Well, these are still things that we need to uncover in future studies. Right now, we are, for example, working on a study that looks at time of premeditation, as when did the person decide to attempt and when did they attempt, how long after, and how is this related to everything else that we have started to explore in the thesis. Now that my defense has ended, I sincerely thank the opponents for the attention they have devoted to my thesis. I now look forward to the decision of the doctoral committee, which will decide whether the degree of Doctor of Philosophy will be granted to me.
I hereby adjourn the public meeting of the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Behavioral Movement Sciences for further deliberations. Please be seated. I reopen this public session. By its duly accorded authority, the Doctoral Examination Committee of the Faculty of Behavioral and Movement Sciences grants the degree of Doctor of Philosophy to Anna Szücs. And I can add to this that this degree is granted with the qualification cum laude. Congratulations. I now invite the supervisors and the co-supervisor, at least the supervisor here present today, and the three co-supervisors either online or later on, to place the signatures to the degree certificate as witnessed of this, as a witness of this deed. And meanwhile, I declare in public that in the privacy of the closed meeting, the candidates, by a signature, stated adherence to the conditions laid down in the provisions in Article 5 of the doctorate regulations of this university regarding rights and responsibilities in science and society. Professor Meyer, appointed by the College of Deans as supervisor, will now perform the investiture. And during the pronouncement of the investiture formula, only the doctorate committee will stand.
By the virtue of the authority vested in me by the management regulations of the Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam, and as supervisor appointed thereto by the College of Deans, I hereby confer on you, Dr. Anna Szücs, the degree of Doctor of Philosophy, together with all rights, privileges, and responsibilities thereto appertaining. In witness thereof, the seal of the university and signatures of the rector and the supervisors have been affixed to the diploma you have about to receive. I think you can clap. Anna, dear Dr. Szücs, wow, this is fantastic. We have talked so much, so many hours. And yes, you got the cum laude. For the ones who do not know what a cum laude is, this is very special. And I think it was a very special event, not only here, but during the past years to really to get to know yourself and to know and to work with us. It's a privilege to stand here, and it's a completion of your PhD. And I must say, you are not only a very remarkable scientist, but you are a very remarkable person. I would love to tell the audience who know you even much better than I do, I think, but to talk a little bit through your journey. So your journey began in Budapest, and then you moved to Geneva with lots of curiosity and determination, I think, from very young age. And you studied medicine and at the University of Geneva. And very quickly, I think you gravitated from the normal medicine to a very specialized medicine, and that's psychiatry, and that's your love, as you always stated. But you also very often said, I do not love the symptoms, but I love the people. And that's what you really showcased during the 3 years we were working together. You really want to understand what's inside. And I would, as an internal medicine specialist, always look at the organs, at the heart, etc. But you really want to understand their worlds and how they are thinking and what their motives are, and especially what their challenges are to be so powerful in life. And you did that so powerful, and you showed that to us. From the Geneva hospital, you went to Pittsburgh. And there, I think there was the spark of doing even more research and carried out your clinical skills actually in that science with Professor Kati Santo and Alex Rurovsky. So, and they really, I think, led to the seed that you are the scientist you are at the moment. And they really illuminated what complexity is. And you beautifully showed that in all your chapters. And I think there you also discovered your own voice, because in Singapore, we were reshaping your voice a little bit, but your own voice is really curiosity, attentiveness, and asking these very difficult questions. I must say, sometimes I said, Anna, why another difficult question? But it was so productive. So thank you so much asking and only asking why. So life brought you then to Singapore, and we met. But first, you worked with, under the guidance, Professor Chima Valderas, and you discovered really the reality of mental health in a system, which might be quite difficult from the ones in Pittsburgh and the ones in Geneva. And you really had to adapt to that Singapore style and how mental health is actually being treated. So I think you did that well, with a couple of challenges here and there. But what you also did, you joined the NUS Academy for Healthy Longevity. And I can only say HALO, which is the survey, and I can only say the Healthy Longevity Talent Incubator. And for the ones who do not know, we actually have a double inauguration at the moment of PhD students at the moment out of the Healthy Longevity Talent Incubator, because at the University of Amsterdam, there's Suzanne Outbeer. We met her also yesterday, who is also defending her PhD. So it's so nice to have you in that circle of the alumni to really define what healthy aging is and healthy aging stands for. So, but I think you are the ones who have so much academic achievements. You brought us together as a global PhD with global supervisors, and you had to really tackle all the time zones all the time. And being in Singapore, we spent many nights together, which I really enjoyed, and also your supervisors really enjoyed. And what you did persistently brought us together. And this is so good because you did it with humor and you did it with creativity, which is stellar. Then you are embarking now on a different journey. So we would really love to hear what the fantasy novel actually is, but I think it's really bringing the novel words and the worlds of individuals together. And of course, you are not celebrating today on your own. You are celebrating it with your parents. In every meeting we had, you were really smiling while talking about your parents, and you are speaking so highly about them, of course. So thank you so much, and the congratulations to your parents too. Guillaume, your partner, and then Lichi, and you might know, okay, who is that in the Thesis? It's a dog. It's a wonderful dog. It's a white dog with lots of energy running around Kentville where we are living together. So these are your compassionates, the peers in your life, your anchors. So be proud that you actually did the PhD journey. Don't with lots of fun. Then Katie, Alex, and Chima, these are your supervisors. Thank you so much if you're listening now to guide Anna with us, and we are super proud of you. Thank you, Professor Meyer.
And to the congratulations of the supervisor, I gladly add the congratulations of the College of Deans of the University and of the Faculty of Behavioral and Movement Sciences, and in particular the Department of Human Movement Sciences. We are very proud of the outstanding work that you have performed and defended today, and also added to our department, also in the scope of healthy aging. And we look forward to hear more from you in the near future. Stay in contact. This doctoral examination ceremony is now completed. Doctor of Philosophy Anna Szücs will now lead the procession out of this hall, and I invite you all to follow and follow the cortege afterwards to the reception to congratulate the new doctor. Then I ask you all to stand now. And I close this public meeting of the College of Deans by desiring that our scientific search for truth and wisdom may be beneficial to the world and to humanity.